Hello, and welcome to Art 23 2D Foundations. My name is Bonnie Stipe. I'm the professor for this course. This is the first of a series of PowerPoints that will help guide you through the hybrid portion of this course. And I wanted to start off talking about the visual elements of art. This course is based around two central themes, the first of which is the visual elements of art, the second of which is the principles of art. So the visual elements of art are considered the building blocks or the ingredients for a work of art. They're what we perceive and respond to when we look at a work's form. The 7 visual elements are line, shape, mass, and form. They're viewed together. Value or light, color, texture, and space. The first element of art that we're going to look at is line. It's what our first project is based off of. Now, when we think about line, I'm sure you all have heard of line before. There's the mathematical definition of it is a path traced by a moving point. So that's kind of the simplest way of thinking about line. It's also one-dimensional and can vary in width, direction, and length. Lines also often define the edges of a form. Lines can be horizontal, vertical, diagonal, straight, curved, thick, or thin. They can also be used to lead your eye around the composition and communicate information through character and direction. So we're going to look at a couple examples of that next. This is work by Keith Haring. What kinds of lines do you see in this piece? There's a big variety, right? So the first lines that I start looking at are these that go around the outside edges. Those are considered outlines, so they define individual shapes. We also have these lines here down at the bottom. Those lines help to define the movement of the water, right? They wouldn't necessarily be there, but we understand those to be waves. What about these lines? You know, those lines could represent a variety of things. They could show the motion of the wings. They almost look like, you know, those traditional stink lines you see on characters. Or they could be energy. Keith Haring described them as spiritual energy that radiates, so they're symbolic. So the lines in this case can represent symbolism or perception. This piece is by Sarah Sees. What kinds of lines do you see in it? The lines here represent a variety of things. They represent movement, right? If you look, there's lines heading back into space. So we see them heading back through here, right? There's also lines, as we see, that represent circles that represent perception, so they get smaller as they go back in space, right? They also represent movement. As they head back this way into the composition, we imagine ourselves going back further and further into the composition. So what are some ways that line can be used in works of art? The first way is contour and outline, direction and movement, or implied lines. We'll look at each of these 3 ways next. The first one that we're going to look at is outline versus contour line. As I look at this example, which one is an example of outline? The one on the left or the one on the right? If you said the one on the left, you're correct. The one on the left represents shape. We're not looking at a 3-dimensional form, we're looking at 2-dimensional flat pieces. The one on the right represents contour line. Contour line represents a three-dimensional form, so it's attempting to show volume. In this example by Jennifer Pastor, what kinds of lines do you see here? Contour or outline? This is an interesting work of art where you see possibly both, right? There's contour lines that represent form. We also see some outlines showing like the edge of a shoe or flatter shapes. It also could represent movement. We see this, is this one figure going around or multiple figures? Is it showing us different points in time, perhaps? How is line used in this piece by Henri Cartier-Bresson? This is a photograph, but line is still being used. Just look carefully. There's a line that follows down this stairwell, down through the steps, over the women, back around the fence, back through the bottom, back up around the top, and it actually leads our eye back around to the beginning. In this scenario, it's actually helping us move with movement, moving our eye throughout the composition to create something dynamic. Next, we're going to talk about different types of lines. The first type of line that we're going to look at is horizontal lines. Horizontal lines suggest a feeling of rest or repose, because objects that are horizontal are parallel to the earth and are at rest. For example, as we look at this landscape on the right, horizontal lines help to show us the horizon. So if you kind of follow, we've got horizontal lines here, horizontal lines here. They're implied, right? They show us this is a very peaceful, restful composition. What kind of lines do you see here? Do you see any horizontal lines through the middle? There's a horizontal line, right? Now, is this a restful pose or do you feel movement? What helps to imply that movement? What sort of lines? If you said diagonal lines, you're correct. Please notice those lines of the paddle and these lines of the arms help to show that these men aren't sitting still on the water. They're moving, they're rowing, they're tugging, they're breaking that horizontal plane. The next type of line we're going to talk about is vertical lines. Vertical lines often communicate a sense of height because they are perpendicular to the earth, extending upwards towards the sky. For example, in this church interior, the vertical lines help to suggest spirituality or rising up beyond human reach towards the heavens. Here's an example of an image with diagonal lines that help to convey movement. Where do you see diagonal lines in this painting? Right, there's diagonal lines in the cliffside, the diagonal lines of the people, the diagonal lines of the waves, the diagonal lines of the ship, right? What's the one stable thing that you see in this piece? You said the lighthouse, you're correct. Those vertical lines help to give us stability. We understand that there's something that won't be knocked over from this storm. This next piece, Géricault's The Raft of the Medusa, is based on an actual event, a catastrophe. It's a shipwreck. So the men are sort of stuck at sea, desperately waiting for help, hopefully seeing a ship off in the distance. What sort of lines do you see in this piece? There's all kinds of lines, right? There's twisted, intertwined, irregular. Sharply curved, twisted lines can convey turmoil, chaos, even violence. For example, in this sculpture, the lines of the contorting bodies and the serpent help convey the intensity of the struggle. So when we see those kind of lines intertwining, it can present to us that struggle. The next type of line we're going to talk about is implied lines. Does anyone see a letter inside of this piece? If you said S, you are correct. But there isn't actually a line that makes the letter S. The letter S is made from all the lines stopping at a particular point. This is what implied lines are. Implied lines are lines that our minds pick up on, that aren't really there, but we can see them. Let's take a look at this piece and look for lines. Where do you see implied lines taking place? There's not any really distinct lines, correct? But there are lines that lead our eye through the composition. Well, if I start down here on the end, and I follow the arms, the direction of the people, all the way back down through here, actually leading my eye back to a little focal point back there. That's one of the things that implied line can do. They help to create a dynamic composition. All right, so the next elements of art that we're going to talk is shape and mass. We usually talk about shape and mass together because shape is a two-dimensional form. It occupies an area with identifiable boundaries, an outline square, or a shift in color or texture, while mass is a three-dimensional artwork that occupies a volume of space. So a mass of clay, the mass of mountain architecture. So you can think about, it's basically a flat piece versus a piece that has volume. So let's look at a couple examples. This is a piece by Bill Reed called The Raven and First Men. Which would you say this piece is? Shape or mass? This piece is definitely mass. It's a sculpture, right? We can see the volume in each of the forms. It's very bulging. You can walk around it and see all sides. That's what's considered mass. Let's look at this piece by Emmy Whitehorse. This is considered a shape, right? Because it's flat. And the shapes are both represented by changes in value. So we have these very dark forms here, right? Or texture. You can see sort of the variety of texture that we see in that shape. Next type of shapes and forms we're going to talk about are organic shapes and forms. Organic shapes and forms are typically irregular or asymmetrical. Organic shapes are often found in nature, but man-made shapes can also imitate organic forms. In this example, we see a Greek wreath that's meant to simulate leaves and berries. Geometric shapes and forms are those that are man-made. They often include mathematical name shapes such as squares, rectangles, circles, cubes, spheres, cones. Geometric shapes and forms are often man-made, although there are some natural forms that also have geometric shapes. You can see this cabinet is decorated by circles, triangles, rectangles, and it's a big rectangle itself, so it's a geometric form. There's also, with shapes and forms, something that's called figure versus ground. We perceive shapes by mentally detaching them from their surroundings. We refer to this relationship as figure and ground. So in this example, we see a man, right? The man is our shape. The ground is the background. And if you can look, there's shapes formed by the area in between, right? There's a little triangle right here. Let's try this with a little bit more ambiguous form. So in this situation, which one is the figure? Which one is the ground? Is the figure the yellow? Or is the figure the purple? I'll give you a hint, there's no right answer to this. Some of you may have mentally detached the yellow and see that as the figure and the purple is the ground. Others of you might have mentally detached the purple and see the yellow as the ground. This type of occurrence is more common than you think, and often in a successful composition, both can be important, right? So there's a name for this occurrence. It's called figure versus ground, or positive versus negative shapes. So instead of calling something the figure, we call it the positive shape. And instead of calling something the ground, we call it the negative shape. So we're back to that M.C. Escher drawing again. If we look at the top of this drawing, we'll see a bird as the figure at the top. If we look at the bottom of the drawing, we see a fish as the figure. But in the middle, something strange happens, right? As we move down, at one point, they both exist together. That's why we could call it's a positive and negative shaped interplay. So it's one of those situations where the background is equally as important as the foreground. That is one of the things that helps make a successful composition. As mentioned before, something happened that's called implied shapes. Did you see an implied shape in this image? If you said triangle, you're correct. Even though there's not really a triangle, our mind connects the dots, right? Just like our mind connects the dots with implied line, implied shapes, we mentally create a composition. What's the implied shape in this piece? This is by Raphael, the Madonna of the Meadows. If you said triangle, you're correct. Notice here, this is a triangular composition. Triangular compositions were very common during the Renaissance. Renaissance artists believed that a triangular composition represented perfect balance. It also represented something spiritual, the Holy Trinity. So they saw those two things as being represented of perfection. The next element of art that we're going to talk about is light and value. Light is a type of radiant energy. It comes from the sun. It also is something that we can generate ourselves through electricity or fires. But how do artists use it? This is a piece by James Turrell, which the piece is the piece along the top there. In this piece, Turrell has created a light piece made of actual light. It's a hole in the ceiling that actually creates a blue light that lights a Quaker meeting house in Houston. And Turrell believed that light is a metaphor for spiritual reflection. Light has always been considered powerful spiritually if we look back through history. And Turrell's trying to harness that power itself. If you're interested in hearing more about Turrell's work, there's a short video here you can watch about him talking about his work. But oftentimes he really thinks about the power of light and its ability to transform. This is a piece by Doug Wheeler. If you've ever seen, what is that music video? Drake in his Call Me on My Cell Phone video, I think it's that one, but he's actually mimicked some of Doug Wheeler's pieces. He's also interested in light and how it has a material presence. So there's another form of light that we are going to use more in this class. It's called implied light. That's how we model mass in 2 dimensions. Oftentimes this is called value. So shades of light and dark. When we think about value scale, value is how we actually are able to perceive 3-dimensional forms. This is an example of a photograph, a gelatin silver print from 1935. And there is implied light seen here because we don't see the light source directly. The only way that we can understand what these figures are by the way that light hits them. Where do you think the light source is coming for? You said upper right-hand corner. You're right. It's sort of coming down and across the figures themselves. And we see them. The only way we understand that they're 3-dimensional is that we see the light coming from their faces over here, and it's darker from behind. It helps them understand their mass. Chiaroscuro, or the Italian word for light and dark, is a way that artists use light to record the contrasts and show the natural world. Renaissance artists believe that, by showing dramatic lighting, you help to convey the emotion within a scene. It's one of the reasons we see such high contrast in many Renaissance drawings and paintings. Does this piece represent light and dark? How is it different from the pieces we saw before? If you said through line, you're correct. This is called hatching and cross hatching. We're going to work on a hatching and cross hatching piece later on in this semester, but hatching and cross hatching can be used to represent value as well. Hatching means areas of closely spaced parallel lines, while cross-hatching means additional sets of parallel lines laid across the first. You can see the closer the lines are together, the darker in value it appears. The further apart, the lighter. There's another technique called stippling, in which artists use dots to create value. So the closer the dots are together, the darker the value is. The further apart, the lighter. Color is the next element of art that we'll talk about. We will go over color and color theory in great detail later in the semester, We're just going to do a short overview now of what color is. Does anybody recognize what we're looking at? It's a prism, right? What happens in a prism? Within a prism, white light comes down into the prism or the raindrop and is split or separated into all its individual colors by a prism. The only way that we can perceive color is through light. So color is a function of light. Without light, there is no color. If you walk into a dark room with all the lights out, nothing's in color, right? If there's a little bit of light, the colors are dull. If there's a lot of light, the colors are bright. Color is one of those things that gives us pleasure in the world. It's a psychologically powerful element. Red in restaurants increases appetite. Blue lowers blood pressure. It actually has physiological effects on us. Later on in the semester, we'll also talk about something called a color wheel. Color wheel has all of the basic colors that we are actually going to learn how to mix. There are three types of colors: the primary colors, from which all other colors are made; the secondary colors, which are what you get when you mix two primaries; and the tertiary colors, which are the colors you get from mixing a primary and a secondary color. One of the first projects we'll work on with color is with warm and cool colors. Warm colors are considered those that relate to the sun, warmth. Think about a hot summer day. Cool colors are something that relates to shadows, breezes, oceans, water. The very interesting thing about paint and color is that all colors in the world can be made out of a very small number of colors. This is a work of art by Pissarro called Palette with a Landscape, and he literally made this painting just from those very few colors that you see along the top: blue, red, yellow, and white. These are a few vocabulary terms that we're going to talk about when we get to color. The first one is hue, or color, pure color on the color wheel; value, the relative lightness or darkness of a color; tint, which is white plus a color; shadow, which is black plus a color; and intensity, the chroma or saturation of a color. We'll talk about these later on when we get to our color project, but this is just a brief overview, and if you're working on the midterm or final, this can be sort of a nice reminder of some of those terms. First one, like I said, is hue. Hue refers to pure colors on the color wheel. So it hasn't been changed in any way by adding white or brown. They're just what you get when you mix those primary, secondary, and tertiary colors together. Tint is each one of those hues plus white. So there could be varying amounts of white you have to make a tint, but tint is always a pure color on the color wheel, or a hue plus white. Shade is black plus a hue, so same thing, pure color on the color wheel plus black, could be in varying amounts. So what we've talked about is just a specific type of color. When we talk about reflective color, when we mix all those colors together, what color do we get? If you said black, you're correct. Although I know some people who have experience with painting, if I mix blue, red, and yellow together, I probably get something more along the lines of brown. But within color theory, you should get black. So what happens with the color that comes out of your screen, or additive color when you're projecting light? Something different happens, right? So instead of being subtractive and taking away color, we're adding color. So it's called an additive color process. All lights mix to produce white. I said this is what's called additive color. Red and green mix to create yellow. Red, green, and blue make the triad of white. So that's what's known as additive color versus subtractive color. There's also another interesting occurrence known as simultaneous contrast. So I want you guys to do is stare at the black dot on the left-hand side of your slide for 30 seconds, starting now. All right, now look at the white. What's happened? If you see a green box in the middle and a red box on the outside, you've experienced what's known as after image. A prolonged staring at a color causes fatigue in our color receptors, and it allows us to reproduce the color's complement as a ghostly after image. So those cones and rods in our eyes got tired and they can only perceive the other half of the color wheel. It's also known as simultaneous contrast. Our eyes help to play tricks on us. It's called an optical effect. It's one of the reasons why often artists use complementary colors as the shadows in an image. So in this example, when he paints orange leaves, oftentimes he uses bluish green shadows. It also is naturally occurring out in the world. Has anyone seen this famous piece before? Seurat's A Sunday on the Grand Jatte. Seurat was an impressionist. He liked to play with simultaneous contrast and after image. Impressionists tinted the shadows with complementary colors of nearby highlights. And he does something very interesting here. It's called optical color mixing. You can see it a little bit more closely in this detail, but he actually puts two colors next to each other and our eyes mix them together to create the color. It's also what's called pointillism. And our computer actually works in a similar way. An image is made of individual pixels that our eye seamlessly blends together. Your inkjet printer also works this way. So up close, it looks something like this. But at a distance, it looks like this. artists are more loose with their use of after image. One the artist we'll look at later on in the semester, Chuck Close, uses the same method. He grids a photo onto a larger canvas and allows each one of the squares to optically mix, sort of almost like a water bead effect. Each little square is like its own little individual abstract painting. Devra Sperber also uses this optical mixing effect. You can see this is a piece actually of Jimi Hendrix. Each one is made of little spools of thread, and she's interested in the way in which our eye sees. So when our eye perceives information, it actually flips it upside down, and our brain turns it back right side up. You can see there's a close-up of one of her other images. You can see the little spools of thread, and in the ball it has what our eye actually perceives. It's really about the way our eye works. Color also has emotional effects. If you look at this piece by Whistler on the right, Nocturne in Blue and Gold, what sort of emotional effect do you feel? It's very blue, right? Blue can be associated with spirituality, calm. Blue can also be linked to sadness or the night. How about this piece? How is color used? This is Edvard Munch's The Scream. Munch said when talking about this painting in his journal, "I sensed a shriek passing through nature. I painted this picture, painted the clouds as actual blood." So the red indicated horror, blood, anguish. Facial expression clues us into his whole intent, also the diagonal swirling lines. The next element of art that we're going to talk about is texture. Texture refers to a surface quality or a perception of smooth, rough, flat, bumpy, fine, or coarse. There are two types of texture. One is actual texture, or the way we experience something through touch. So for example, this work by Tara Donovan, made out of actual straw, if I walked up to it and touched it, it would feel very rough and scratchy. This piece, Prayer Mat by Mona Hatoum, is a prayer mat that's made out of a dense field of brass pins. It's considered a controversial piece. Why do you think it's considered controversial? Hatoum refers to this piece as a way in which religion can be somewhat of a difficult thing. It's meant to raise questions like, who would kneel on such a rug? Is inflicting pain on ourselves a sacrifice which a God receives with gratitude? Can religion be a torment, or is it something that we are sacrificing for a greater good? It asks a lot of questions, but it doesn't give any answers. You can think, it also shows perhaps the sacrifice that many Muslims have given, especially in the world climate that we have today, in order just to practice their religion. This piece, Bird in Space, has a different kind of texture. It's a smooth texture. How do you think the smooth texture adds to the piece? Would it feel as smooth or as aerial-like and bird-like with a very rough texture. The smoothness helps to add towards the upward lift that we feel in the piece. There's also something known as visual texture. Visual texture means that there is an implied texture. So for example, this painting surface is smooth, but the way that the paint has been applied helped to create a sense of water texture, crowdedness, roughness, or even choppiness. Visual texture in this piece does something different. It helps to imply the smoothness of his velvet cape. Pattern is the next element we're going to talk about, or any decorative, repetitive motif or design. Pattern gives a visual texture, but it can also create visual buzz or spatial ambiguity. You can see here, what is the repeated pattern? It's variations of squares and rectangles, right? The next element of art that we're going to talk about is space. Space is three-dimensional, meaning we actually see space, but there's also something known as implied space or two-dimensional space. This can be made through position, overlap, linear perspective, foreshortening, atmospheric perspective, or isometric perspective. This first piece is by Alberto Giacometti, The Nose. What would this piece be like if there were not a line going through either side? Giacometti was fascinated by how we perceive objects in space. In this piece, he framed the figure with a cubic volume of space. It helps to show the nose protruding, almost making it was getting longer and longer. He described this as the way he perceived his friend's nose, just as he was beginning to pass in old age. What is the three-dimensional space that we see in this piece? It's a gate, correct? So it is a gate that is hanging upside down. Does anybody notice a second gate? If you said the reflection, yes, there is actually another gate that actually looks more correct in the reflection on the top of the ceiling, if you can kind of see it here. The top is what's known as implied space. Implied space is imagined three-dimensional space. We can actually think about it as something that's known as the picture plane, or the flat literal space on which the two-dimensional artwork exists. How is space implied in this piece? What's closest to you and what is furthest away? It's difficult to tell, right? But we do probably think that these figures down here at the bottom are closest to us. There's a reason for this, and we perceive things that are lower on our picture plane to be closer to us, and things that are further towards the top as being further away from us. If you look out in the room right now, this is something that naturally occurs. Things that are very close to us are lower in our visual plane. Things that are further away are higher in our visual plane. Which person do you think is closer to you? This person here on the end or this person on this side? If you said the one down here on the end, you're correct. This is known as something as overlap. So if we see one thing in front of the other, we perceive it as being closer to us, and therefore it creates an imagined space. Linear perspective is a mathematical version of some of the things that we talked about to create implied space. It comes from the Italian art of the 1400s, where they discovered a system for depicting optically convincing space. Linear perspective helped with this system in two ways. They realized that forms seem to diminish in size as they recede away from us. They also noticed that parallel lines receding into the distance seem to converge until they meet at a point on the horizon where they disappear. This is called the vanishing point. The development of linear perspective dramatically changed how artists viewed the picture plane. Pre-Renaissance, a picture was primarily on a flat surface covered with shapes and colors. For Renaissance artists, it became a window into a scene. They sort of reconceived artwork as a window. Many paintings were created for no reason other than to show off the possibilities of this new technique. For example, this piece here, the stones, the pavement, show the mechanics of linear perspective. So if we see, if we're looking straight down on this grid work, they would be parallel lines. But as they go back in space, they converge back to that vanishing point. One of the most famous pieces from art history that uses linear perspective is this piece, Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper. Da Vinci was interested in using linear perspective not only for its ability to create space, he also used it as a conceptual tool. If I follow all of the lines back to their vanishing point, they all lead to one spot. And if you're familiar at all with this painting, you'll realize that central image is Christ, who is the most important figure in the piece. You can also notice he uses other sort of implied lines to create some dramatic tension in the piece, showing those that are with Christ, against Christ. If you ever read the Da Vinci Code, there's also some very interesting readings into some of those hand gestures and movements of each of the disciples in that piece. The other interesting thing about this piece, it's a fresco, which is a type of painting that's done on wet plaster. At the time, Da Vinci used a brand new method he came up with. Instead of using the traditional fresco method, he attempted to use oils with the fresco, which did not hold up over time. Over the centuries, some very well intended but heavy-handed attempts have left scholars wondering what the original actually looked like. This is sort of my joke version of this, but it's about conservation. They actually sort of, if you've ever seen this piece, the recreation of a Spanish piece where a woman went in and tried to recreate it, you can kind of see some of those heavy-handed attempts. Well, it's not, the Last Supper probably isn't in that bad of shape, but you can see why conservationists understanding art history and the practice of art is very important. Foreshortening is another type of version of creating the illusion of three-dimensional space. And foreshortening, it follows the rules of perspective, but it says that the logic of linear perspective must be applied to every form, not just the forms that are geometric, but all of those organic shapes, including human and animal forms. So you can see there's something not quite right about this piece, right? If we stretch that guy out, he'd have pretty strange looking short little legs, and that horse would be pretty squat, right? So this was before they had quite mastered foreshortening. Albert Brewer is considered one of the masters of foreshortening. You can see here he is with his Brewer machine. He realized that he came up with a mathematical method of taking something that is organic and putting it into geometric form. It helped to make linear perspective, or easier to put linear perspective onto organic shapes. Atmospheric perspective is another way to create illusionistic three-dimensional space. An atmospheric perspective is the optical effect caused by the atmosphere that interposes itself between us and the objects that we perceive. We see this actually happen often in real life here in the Bay Area, where some days, if we look up at the East Bay Hills, they're very sort of cloudy, light green. Other days, when there's less atmosphere, we can see much more detail and they're brighter. Artists realize this. The atmosphere actually gets in the way of us perceiving things. Atmospheric perspective also means that we see things in more detail up close. The further away we get, they're less detailed.